Okay.
My name is Abina Johnson, and this is Focus on Liberia. Hit it! From Cape Mount to Cape Palmer, Mount Nimba to Atlantic Ocean, Obomi Hills to Pokondre, to educate, elevate, and promote. Yeah, focus on Liberia. For Liberia, Liberia. For Liberia, yeah, 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 yeah. From Monday to Sunday. From Monday to Sunday. It's focus on Liberia. Talk about home affairs. Hey. In diaspora. Current affairs. Hey. Reliable information. History. Ooh. Talking about culture. Yeah. Politics. Education. Entertainment. Yeah. Business. Sports. Advertisement. Articulation. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. From Monday to Sunday. Focus on.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
clearly.
Okay. Okay. So welcome to the Focus on Liberia show. And this is the Liberian Studies Association Scholar Hour. We haven't come on for a while, but we are here today. The Liberian Studies Association was founded in 1968. It is one of the oldest scholarly organizations in the United States that is focused on African studies. And the Liberian Studies Association Journal is the second oldest African studies journal published continuously in the US. We want to welcome all of you to the show. Please share the show, share it with your friends. Come and learn some Kru history, things that you did not know. Share it very widely with your friends. So before we start, I just want to remind you that the Liberian Studies Association 56th Annual Conference will be held from April 24th to the 26th at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. So please join us. You can go on the website for more information. And today we are pleased and honored to have two scholars whose research focus on the Kru. They have done phenomenal work, and we are very, very grateful that they have taken time off their busy schedule to come and share some of their knowledge with us. First, we have Megan Krucher. She's a maritime and archaeologist who is completing a PhD in anthropology at Texas A&M University. Archaeologist, sorry. She holds a master's in public history from, is it Dukusk?
Duquesne.
Duquesne University. I was like Queensne. I don't know. Duquesne University, and a bachelor's in history. Megan's research broadly investigates how West African sailors shape and influence the Atlantic world. Her current focus is on how the Kru of Liberia used maritime traditions to resist colonization between the 17th and the 19th centuries. She is the co-director with Prince D. Conde of a grassroots history project in Sino. It is called the Kru Coast Heritage Initiative. The initiative works with communities to understand how Kru history is remembered and commemorated today. And Megan, today, her topic will be understanding Kru history through maritime culture. And then we have Kweku Minta Dankwa, who is a PhD candidate in the African History program at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So Kweku obtained his MPhil from the University of Ghana in 2020 and his bachelor's degree from the University of Education in Winnipeg. Mr. Dankwa's research interests include African decolonization, African American and diasporan return migrations to Africa, the creation of Black colonial projects such as Liberia and the transnational and European imperial histories in West Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. His current research project examines the transnational history of Kru diaspora, international politics across British West Africa territories of Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, and Nigeria. The project examines the ways indigenous Kru people from Liberia use their diasporic urban connections in British West Africa to challenge Americo-Liberian Black American domination of the Republic of Liberia and British colonialism in the 19th and 20th century. And his topic is Kru in West African history, diaspora and transnational politics between Liberia and the Gold Coast, which is modern Ghana. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much. And as you can see, there are a lot of people on. So we're gonna get started right away. We have an hour. So first of all, Megan, let's start with you. How did you get interested in Kru history?
Thank you so much for having us on. I'm also really excited to be here. So I got interested in Kru history from the maritime side. My PhD at Texas A&M is in nautical archaeology, which is archaeology of boats and ships and history of boats and ships and trade routes and things like that. And I had a focus on West Africa. And as many people know, if you're looking at West Africa and the maritime, you cannot escape the Kru. They're everywhere and their stories are everywhere being documented by especially British sources. And so as I was doing research, I was really interested in this history and sort of where it was coming from. And I noticed that a lot of the history that had been written wasn't necessarily focused on the Kru in a very small area of Sino County. It was more focused on the Kru diaspora around the world and Kru involvement as sailors. And so I really wanted to narrow in on the specific area in Sino County. And that's what got me really interested in specifically the Kru history in Sino County, even though the Kru are spread across multiple different regions and countries and areas.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I didn't know that. I mean, I know that when it comes to maritime and sailing, the Kru are experts in that. But as we're talking about before the show started, I didn't know that they were so spread all over the world. I didn't know that. So it will be very interesting to find out how they went all over the world. So Kweku, we come to you. How did you get interested in Kru history, and tell us a little bit about your project?
All right. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk about this project, especially with audience from Liberia. So I'm originally from Ghana. I grew up in a town called Winnipeg, which is closer to the Bujumbura refugee camp. So I had friends in the Bujumbura camp, which had a lot of Liberians. And growing up in Ghana, we were used to listening to Liberian people speak. We call the English, the colloquial, we call it Kru Brofo, right? So Brofo means English. So we call the Liberian colloquial Kru English, right? So I grew up learning about the Kru people, but most of the things that I knew about the Kru people, I was thinking, most of my friends, you were thinking that it was just as a result of the Civil War, which occurred in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, right? So I think my original research that I wanted to do for my master's was to look at mining history in Ghana. And I began to read books, and I realized that the Kru had been in Ghana since the 19th century. And I was taken aback, right? Because I knew some Kru people. I went and I see like Kru people had been in Ghana. They were very useful to the colonial economy of Ghana, the 19th century, and nobody talks about them, right? So I just switched my research interests, and then I decided to research on the history of Kru people in Ghana, not to focus only on the Civil War, but look at how they contributed to the colonial economy of Ghana, but we don't really talk about these people, not only about the economy, but also cultural innovations, right? Ghanaians talk a lot about high life, but if you look at the music that the Kru sailors were playing, like those were the foundation of high life, right? Yeah, in terms of language, in terms of pop culture in urban colonial Ghana, right? So I realized this was something that people have not really dealt with, and I decided to just hop in and learn more about the Kru people between Ghana and Liberia.
Thank you. So we'll come back to the role of the Kru with the British Navy. So tell us a little bit about that, Megan. Tell us, how did they? I mean, since they were fishermen, it naturally follows. But how did they get so involved with the British Navy?
Yeah, so the Kru involvement with European shipping is actually much longer than just the 19th century. It starts almost as soon as Europeans start sailing to West Africa. So we have Portuguese accounts of, the area where Liberia is now. Obviously, at that time, it's not called Liberia. There's no such knowledge of this thing called Liberia. That's a much later invention. But at the time the Portuguese arrive in the 15th century, they're talking about people coming out to their ships with canoes to trade things like ivory and pepper. Rice was a huge good that was traded, fresh water, because all of these European ships who are sailing around this area, they had no idea what they were going to encounter when they set out from Europe at that time. These were some of the first European ships to enter the Atlantic, really. And so a lot of the time they didn't have enough fresh water. They didn't have enough food on board. And so they end up really trading with a lot of indigenous African groups, the Kru included probably, to provision their ships. And then this actually continues that sort of pattern of provisioning ships and sending fresh water and rice and other, goods for consumption aboard the ship continues from the Kru and from other groups in Liberia into the 19th and 20th centuries. So the Kru got involved with this shipping a lot earlier than the British even knew about West Africa and the Atlantic. The British really start to come onto the scene after a lot of the other Europeans had already figured out some of these major points. So the British start to come onto the scene in the later 1500s. One of the first British accounts we have of this area of Liberia is from 1588. And so the British start to come even much earlier than like the 19th century as well. And they're doing a lot of trading for pepper, for ivory, especially for palm oil, and for other goods, as well as the slave trade off of West Africa. But where the Kru really start to become famous and they really start to become called Kru as they are today is mostly in the 18th and 19th century with the British, when the British are working to stop the slave trade. So a lot of the documentary evidence we have of the Kru from that period comes from British archives, where these British ships are involved in trying to stop other nations from trading enslaved people. So we know that the British and the Americans abolished the slave trade in 1807, but that doesn't mean that the slave trade stopped off of West and West Central Africa. There are still Portuguese ships coming from Angola and other areas trading in enslaved people across the Atlantic. And so the British and the Americans joined their navies together in what was called the Africa Squadron. And basically their entire job was to stop these other countries' ships from illegally exporting enslaved people. Statistically, the Africa Squadron wasn't super effective in terms of like the overall numbers of enslaved people that continued to be taken and exported from West Africa. But a lot of the sailors on these British and American ships were Kru. And so a lot of the documents that we have talking about Kru identity and Kru sailing skill and sort of Kru social structures come from a lot of these British and American ships that are working to stop the slave trade in the 1800s. So that's where the Kru really gets started with a lot of these documents talking about them. And then they continue a lot of those relationships with the Americans and the British, and they sort of build this reputation as very skilled sailors and very skilled pilots and basically maritime workers of all sorts of trades. It's not just sailing ships with actual sails and things like that. As the British start to bring steamships to West Africa, the crew are employed on steamships as well. So they become very skilled at sailing all different types of ships throughout the 1800s into the 1900s. And then by the time of World War II, because they have these very strong relationships with the British, and I'm sure Kweku can talk a lot about this as well, where they've developed these very strategic partnerships with the British, and a lot of crew men actually end up enlisting in World Wars I and II for the Allied powers. We actually have a really cool painting that you can find online by a German painter, Thomas Baumgartner, painted during World War I, not World War II, World War I, of two crewmen in a German prison camp in World War I. This guy had been painting all of the different nationalities and ethnicities and groups of people that were imprisoned in this World War I German prison camp. And there happened to be two crew guys in this camp who were part of the British Navy and ended up getting their portrait painted. It's a really beautiful image. And you can find it online if you Google like Baumgartner World War I crew. And it's a really cool image that shows a lot of evidence of how important they were to some of these wars and naval battles.
That's really, really great to know that the crew were instrumental. I read somewhere where they said that the British thought that they couldn't get malaria, so they were immune to malaria. So of course they were in times of sickness, they were there to help. But Kweku, could you add on to what Megan said about World War II and the British and the crew?
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between the British and the crew, I mean, it's a very strong relationship. I mean, sometimes very contentious because crew demands sometimes go against British colonial regime. So my research, what I try to do in my research is to look at how the crew were straddling different identities, right, between the Gold
Yes.
Coast
Okay.
and then in Liberia, right. So for example, it gets to a point where the crew are protesting against the Liberian state, and then they now use the British colonial government in the Gold Coast to counteract the Liberian states, right? I mean, one clear example was the case of Juan Imle's protest in the 1930s. Going against the Liberian states, right? So this was a period where Liberia had been investigated by the League of Nations, and then I think there was some kind of crisis, right? And Juan Imle was making the point that he was not a subject of the Liberian state, right? And that he was a subject of the British, and he was making reference to an agreement between the British and then the Liberian state itself, right? And interestingly,
Okay.
I see that Juan Imle was also relying on the networks of crew people, not within Liberia itself, but crew people in British West Africa. So most of the correspondence you see crew people in the Gold Coast in Accra, and I'm sure most Liberians who have been to Accra, Jamestown, that's where most of the crew people were, where there was like this kind of correspondence, right? So again, because of the crew relationship with the British, we see some kind of antagonism between the Liberian states and then the British colonial government, right? Because the Liberian states feels that the British state was kind of backing the crew people in order to oust the Black Republic, right? Again, so issues about race comes in. That the British is using the crew people to so. I mean, I think the relationship is very interesting, and most scholars of West African politics have not really thought about these questions, right? About political imaginations and political activism across national borders during the colonial period.
And it's interesting about using different identities when the situation warrants it, because I was thinking that because I was doing some readings, and it also said that the crew, they had tattoo on their faces to differentiate themselves from the formerly enslaved Black Africans. So they felt, well, as they should, because they were helpful to the British government, that they felt that because of their prowess on the ocean, that they should be more valuable in especially during the war. But it would say it will be very inevitable that the Liberian government would say, "Hey, look, you're our subjects and not the subjects of the British." So the concept of culture as a tool of resistance is it comes to play there as they go on. When is there an instance in the history where when the Kru got, I'm sure that they must have had conflict with the British, that the Liberian government got involved for them or no?
I think that's an interesting question. That's some of the questions that I try to answer. So interestingly, too, in cases where the Kru have conflicts with the British government, they now resume their Liberian identity to
Yes.
fight against the British, right? I mean, so in the 1930s, in British colonial, I mean, in colonial Ghana, there was the native administrative system, right? So indirect rule, right? And
Yes,
most
yes.
scholars have made a point that indirect rule was very racial because it's kind of like reinforces some kind of racial hierarchies, right? So European, British on top, and then the natives, they have their own jurisdiction. Now, one of the key things is that, I mean, and most scholars have written about this, that traditional authorities were now using this indirect rule to kind of, should I say, coerce people, right? Like force people and try sometimes abuse people. They use indirect rule in their own rights, Yeah. And again, this is a British colonial system which favors the British, right? And the Kru people are now trapped in this system. What do they do? So they now have to rely on their Liberian citizenship and make the point that this indirect rule should not apply to us because we are not British subjects. Again, we are
Yes.
not subjects. We are from an independent African country which have signed agreements with the Liberian government, right? So the kind of argument that the Kru were making was novel in West Africa, right? Like because they were using the argument of sovereignty, right? The argument of the Black Republic. So it is not that they were simply rubbishing the Liberian state per se, but they were trying to negotiate or navigate their own place in this complex political system, right? Colonial rule in West Africa and also the Liberian state itself. So there were instances where the Kru come disagree with the British colonial government because of their policies, and there they resume their Liberian identities, Liberian sovereignty, black self-determination to fight against colonial rule in British West Africa.
We keep. I'm sorry because of time. We keep straggling, and to the viewers, if you have questions, please put them in the chat so we can discuss it because we don't have a lot of time. So talking about the Kru and how they travel all over. Megan, tell me some of the places they went and what evidence is there to prove that they went there.
So there are some really cool case studies that Jeff Gunn talks about in his 2021 book about the Kru diaspora. But some of the really interesting ones that I know of from the 19th century would be in South Africa. And Jeff Gunn did a whole chapter about this. In South Africa, there is a cemetery of Kru sailors. It's like the Kru Sailors Cemetery in Simonstown in South Africa. And there are a couple of other papers about this where, because the British had established those like naval outposts in South Africa during the later 19th century, like the 1850s, 60s, and even into the 1900s, there were Kru towns in South Africa. The Kru were really instrumental in Livingstone's expeditions into Central Africa, as well as those British expeditions in the interior of Africa that were trying to find like the supposed source of the Nile and all these other things. So they had hired Kru sailors and Kru laborers as well. Through personal anecdotes, I know that there is a Kru presence in the Caribbean. There are Kru sailors who ended up not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but also in, I believe, Barbados. And there are a large number of Kru people because of the connection with Liberia as well in the Caribbean. We know that the Kru are not just indigenous to Liberia. I think a commenter just put this as well. There are a large number of Kru in the Ivory Coast. So the Kru sort of ethnic group or tribe, as we could put it, spans not just Liberia, but also into Ivory Coast and into the interior as well, not just the coastal region. So there are really Kru people around the world as a result of their own sort of making and as a result of their employment for the British and other powers. Something Kweku was just saying in his discussion as well was about some of these transnational connections and networks that the Kru negotiate. I'm really interested in the future in exploring some of the same questions with Ivory Coast, because the French colonial rule in Ivory Coast ends up in a very different way than British colonial rule in Ghana or in Gold Coast. And so I wonder if some of these claims to citizenship and advocacy also get negotiated across that border as well. Again, there is, I guess, some of a language barrier between French being the colonial language in French West Africa versus English being the colonial language in British West Africa and in Liberia as well. But that would be very interesting to explore some of those connections between the Ivory Coast Kru and the Liberia Kru, because we tend to put those colonial borders on groups of people that don't actually exist, in their own history.
Yeah.
And
Okay, yeah. I mean, just to add to it, I mean, I think a very good reference or starting point would be Jeff Gann's 2021 book. I mean, talking about Kru migrations to as far back as China. I mean, as far as China, right? Yeah, in the 19th century, engaged in the Opium Wars. I mean, yeah. Interestingly, I mean, I was surprised to see that, like, the Kru engaging in wars of British expansion in colonial Ghana. So most of the Asante wars that the British engaged in, we had Kru people getting involved in the Kru people in Lagos, right? Building a very good source of labor for Lagos. But one, of course, in colonial Ghana, where I really pay attention to, we have different Kru towns in Ghana. We have one in Sekende, one in Cape Coast, one in Accra, in Jamestown. But the most recent addition that I've seen, right? Again, talking about Kru transnational politics, even in Namibia, right? And I think scholar William Blakemore Leon writes about Kru labor in Namibia and how they engage in Gaveism, right? So they were the central force of Gaviite movement in Namibia. So there is a wide possibility of Kru migrations, and I'm making the point that if we focus on Kru histories in West Africa, it kind of gives us wide possibilities as to different ideas about politics and transnational movements within the region.
And we can't negate Freetown either. Freetown, Sierra Leone, being probably the most commonly known center of like Kru towns and things.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably so frequently known that we even forget to mention it at first. So
yeah, that's true. Yeah, and then even in Liverpool, right? Yeah, I think Dan Frost writes about Kru diaspora in Liverpool. So I mean, it's very difficult to get, and I think that's one strength of Jeff Gann's work. He tries to bring together all these different movements of the Kru, right? But I'm just looking at the movement of the Kru within British West Africa because it's too big for dissertation. Yeah.
So I was listening to Megan talk about the Ivory Coast and then Freetown and Liberia, and thinking that it will be an interesting study, because if you look at the Kru in Ivory Coast, for example, I mean, with the assimilation, their claim to citizenship would be quite different from the indirect rule of the British. So that would be an interesting study. Prince Conde, Megan's colleagues, writes that the mark that differentiates the Kru people from other native people at that time is called the domana, meaning one luck, and it was found crouching in the center of the nose. Oh, okay, it was the mark that they gave to say that, okay, I'm different from the formerly enslaved Black Africans. Okay, so is it that when the crew got on the boat, on the ships, and went all over, they chose to remain, and so that's why their reach is far, that some of them just chose to remain there instead of coming back?
For sure, I think that some of them probably chose to stay in the places they ended up. In Liverpool, for example, we have a lot of people, even nowadays, who are descended from crew sailors who came to Liverpool and married Irish or British women and had families
You mean
there.
Liverpool in Europe, in England?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Huge communities there. And so I think that partially, probably some of them chose to stay. Some of them maybe got dropped off and then, couldn't find employment again. There are a wide range of reasons why people might migrate, right? But I think a lot of it was maybe choice of, this kind of cosmopolitan sort of worldview of, I've had a lot of experiences around the world and I'm choosing to stick in this place, very, very common concerns or experiences that we might have today, where it's like, oh, I've traveled the world and I've seen a bunch of different places and I've finally found somewhere I'm willing to call home and settle down and have a family. I think that might have been the experience of some of these crew sailors in the past. We know for sure that some of them returned to their hometowns and did that as well. So, a wide variety of experiences that they probably had.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I mean, for the case of colonial Ghana, we see a competition between like the British and then the French for crew labor, right? So like most of the crew would have to pass through Cote d'Ivoire before they get to Ghana, and sometimes because of the labor needs in Cote d'Ivoire itself, they don't allow them to cross over. Of course, I mean, they had to entice them. So one of the key things which kind of consolidated crew diaspora in colonial Ghana was specific legislations, right, to entice crew people. So we see the British passing specific laws just for the crew people, just to entice them to come in with their families. So, for example, in the 1890s in Ghana, there is a legislation where crew people were given free healthcare, right? Like, yeah, just for only crew people. Indigenous Ghanaians don't have such legislation. They have to pay for their healthcare, but crew people get free healthcare. That's the same period where they set up enclaves for crew people. So you see legislations where they give specific places or areas for crew people to settle on. So, I mean, what I think is that some of these policies by these governments kind of entice the crew people to stay, right? Yeah, kind of entice them to stay. And that would explain why sometimes they would direct their politics against the Liberian government, because that was the same period where the Liberian government was trying to tax them at the port of entry, right? So these ports, like, I mean, tax people who would leave, right? I mean, the headmen and all that. But the situation is different if you go to the British West African territory. So they'll prefer to stay in those areas. So my point is that these migrants, as Megan said, we're making rational choices for themselves, right? Traveled very wide and they chose where they felt would benefit them. But they still, I mean, what I also find is that they still maintain connections back to Liberia. And that's the most interesting thing. That is where the transnational politics comes in, right? So they form associations, groups in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, in Nigeria, just to, I mean, as a form of warfare. And then they all become very much interested in politics or in issues, social issues back in Liberia. So even though they were away, they still had their minds back to Liberia.
And I think that's also reflected in a lot of the sailors who end up in Liverpool. They establish clubs, just like you talk about, like they have the Crew Sailors Club, but they also maintain these identities and connections to their specific hometowns. Like some of the crew sailors in Liverpool specifically talk about how, oh, I come from Setra Crew, I came from Nana Crew, I came from Blue Bari, like all these towns in Sino County that are very well known for being like crew centers. They maintain these connections to that hometown, even though some of them probably never went back after they migrated. So it's also really interesting how that's reflected.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes conflicts in Liberia reflects in the diaspora, right? So disagreement in different crew groups reflects, I mean, in the Gold Coast, and the colonial government will have to come into resolve. So it's some a kind of like a complex system of diaspora making within the crew communities wherever they found themselves.
Speaking about the diaspora communities and about this crew, autonomy and mobility on the one hand, autonomy on one hand, mobility. Tell us a little bit about the material culture. How did it, show itself? What were highlighted? How were the travels? How did the travels influence the culture, or with the music, or anything else?
So the material culture is really interesting. What our project's looking at in Sayegh County with some of this archaeology is that at home in Sayegh County, it seems, at least from the very preliminary evidence that we've gathered, it seems that the crew still very much hold to indigenous traditions and sort of like ways of life. That's the kind of tradition I'm talking about, of like, we're going to cook the same way, we're going to eat the same things, we're going to make the same kinds of ceramic pottery and use those for cooking and you know, carrying water and oil and things like that. Because we do have a presence of imported goods, you know, European wares and things that they were trading and stuff like that. But we do have a lot of indigenous made pottery, especially in the Kru Coast region of Liberia. And so what that seems to suggest, at least at a preliminary level, is that they're really holding to these indigenous ways of life, even as they're balancing a lot of these cosmopolitan interests. And so it, to me, makes it a much more complicated and interesting story where, like, people were not forced to give up one way of life in order to participate in this other sort of global conversations about citizenship and things like that. So we see that in Liberia. And then in terms of other material culture that the crew sort of made and brought with them, especially in British museums, we have so much from Liberia and from the crew. But one object that I really, really like is in the Royal Museums Greenwich in the United Kingdom in Britain. And it's a ivory horn that has carved on it, Ben Freeman sailed at Kru Setra on His Majesty's ship Theiss from Sierra Leone to Ambriz to the satisfaction of the officers. It also says that Ben Freeman was a sober, honest man. And it gives the date 18, I think it's 1813 or 1814 that this horn was carved. So we see a lot of crew carrying these kinds of like resumes in the form of an object or in the form of some kind of like document that like, I'm a good sailor, now you should hire me, British people. And so those are really cool objects in many museums. And they're also in some ways bids for freedom in a world where still at that time, freedom was a very precarious thing for a lot of African sailors. You know, you might get on a ship and the captain promises you that you're going to be paid wages. And when you reach that port, you know, you're discharged at the port and enslaved. You know, there was no guarantee that these promises the British or others made would be upheld. And so by carrying material culture like these objects and by sort of holding to those things, crew sailors were able to make those bids for freedom, for sovereignty, you know, just like they were in later periods. So some of those material culture objects are really fascinating to me. And they're sort of rare in museums. But they're really, really beautiful to see some of those claims for freedom and citizenship. But yeah, in terms of the actual Kru Coast area, we do see kind of this holding to indigenous ways of life and more older patterns of living, while at the same time balancing these cosmopolitan interests.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of the Portuguese. I read somewhere that they when they took Africans to be enslaved there, the woman will always ask for her child to be baptized, and that baptismal paper served as a key for independence later on to say, here's the paper, my child is a freeborn, or something like that. Yeah, this is so fascinating. People have questions. I have one here who he can post the question, but I think a lot of people have this question. This is from Franklin Ben Weller. This is in my phone. He says, we learned that the Vai people are the original natives of Liberia, and other tribes migrated from the north to settle in Liberia. My question to the panelists, can you pinpoint the origin of the Kru people? We know that they have settlements in Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Ivory Coast. And I think there's somebody on this who said that they came from Nubia, I guess, and because of that they were seafarers. Now I don't know, but that's what they wrote. So let us know where are they from? Where are the Kru? Where are the Kwa people from?
There are a lot of different arguments, I think, about that, and a lot of it pushes back into what we would consider like prehistory or like much more ancient times that I think neither Kweku and I really deal with in our research. But one of the biggest narratives for the Kru is that sometime during the 14th or 15th century, the Kru came down from more the Saharan region, that at some point they were part of this kind of Malian area and came down in various different migrations led by a bunch of different people at different times towards the Atlantic coast. And I think that's kind of the predominant consensus, is that at some point in what we might consider the medieval period, the Kru come from more of the northern area and sort of settle and disperse throughout West Africa. And there are various different arguments as to the routes they took and things like that. But I don't see necessarily a lot of concrete evidence for one argument or the other. I just kind of see the evidence that this is the grand narrative, is that at some point in the 14th century or 15th century, they come from sort of the Saharan area down towards the coast. A lot of oral histories give the reason as the search for salt, like the sea salt, which kind of fits with what we know about the Saharan trade at that time and the salt trade out of the Sahara. We also know that prior to the Portuguese coming to West Africa, there was trade across the Sahara with the Mediterranean. So we have Africans in Europe basically throughout, all of European history. There's not like a point in 1470 when the Portuguese reach West Africa and that's the Africans that go to Europe. There were Africans in Europe during the medieval and the Renaissance period. And these are mostly people who come across the Sahara Desert. So that trade was always ongoing. And it's possible that the Kru and other people who came down towards the West African coast were looking for salt as a way to cut out some of these more expensive, mechanisms for salt gathering that happened in the Sahara. But it's still a very understudied area, I think. Medieval African history in terms of like the coastal area. I think there's a lot of gaps that archaeology will be able to fill in the future that we don't necessarily have right now.
I have a personal question about the Kru, and we know that in growing up in Liberia, we always the fishermen we always would say the Fanti people from Ghana. Were there incidents of cooperation, collaboration between the Kru and the Fanti during the Gold Coast time?
So the Kru did not live only in the Fanti region. So the Fanti region, like where the Fantis live, maybe modern day central region, right? The Kru lived beyond that,
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but there's also this history of migration of Gold Coast fishermen moving to other parts of West Africa, right? And Liberia was one of the key places for them. That is obviously understated, right? Yeah. So that points out to the point to the bigger issue that people were moving across these areas, right? Even before these colonial borders came to obstruct people, and also points to another second point that people get generic names, right? So the people who are referred to as the Fanti people in the Kru coast, in the Kru areas, may not be necessarily Fanti, right? They may be from different ethnicities from Ghana, but again, when they get to Liberia, they get the generic name Fanti, right?
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, the same
Yes.
with the Kru, right? The same with the Kru. Whether you are Bassa, Gribo, Mandi.
Gribo, I think Gribo people were on the ship too.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So for us to get to the Gold Coast, you become a Kru, right? Because the locals struggle sometimes to differentiate between different ethnicities from borders which is far away from them, right? Yeah. So of course there is this evidence of like collaboration again because of their work as fishermen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And interesting, just to add, interestingly, most of the places where the crew stayed, even in Ghana, were always at the littorals, right, at the coastal areas, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because of the kind of work that they did.
I
Okay.
think even today, like there's still communities in Liberia where there are a lot of Fanti fishermen and Kru fishermen sort of sharing a lot of area, and you have like this, relationship that still exists.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to remind our viewers, we have a lot of viewers. Megan and Prince have created a grassroots history project in Sino. It's called the Kru Coast Heritage Initiative, right? Megan, you want to talk a little bit about that just briefly before we go on?
Sure. So Prince and I developed this project as a research project, but also as a way to mobilize community members to preserve and protect their own history and heritage. So a lot of what we do is researching Kru history, archaeology, and oral histories, and then mobilizing community members and especially youth to continue to do some of this research. So we work primarily in Sayegh County. We've conducted archaeology at Setra Kru, which is a little bit south of Greenville. And we've also worked with over 20 elders from Sayegh County, mostly from the coastal area, to do oral history interviews. And we're very proud to say that we're able to share some of those. And that the narrators who've given those oral histories all have their own histories on recorded devices to keep for themselves and their families. Right now, we're working especially with youth. So Prince is working with some youth to continue interviewing family members and elders and interested people so that this becomes really sustainable, because a lot of the research on the Kru has mostly come from like outside interest, right? Like, myself and Kweku coming in and saying we're really interested in this. And so what our project is seeking to do is take a lot of that momentum and that scholarship that's already been done and be able to present that to interested members of the public, who might not have heard some of these narratives before, or who might not have been able to participate in some of the history making before. So we're trying to teach youth how to conduct oral history, and to just garner interest in preserving their own history and heritage, because as we know, these things die with the people who preserve them. And so if we're not managing to perpetuate those stories over time, they will be lost to time and to, a variety of disruptions and things like that. So we're seeking to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that a lot of this commemoration and these stories are remembered in the future.
And how receptive are the people to this program, this initiative?
In my experience, we've had a really lovely time. People have really become very passionate about this. And maybe if Prince is watching in the comments, he can put something in there about how to get involved. But we've found that people are really interested and really passionate about learning more about their own history, because as we know, a lot of Liberian history is told from 1822. It's not really told before 1822. So I think a lot of people are really curious about what happened before, and what did I, similar to how a lot of people in the US, right, are like, I didn't learn that in high school. I want to learn more history than I learned in high school, right? I think that's a very global phenomenon. So I think a lot of people are kind of in that headspace of, I didn't learn that before, I want to learn it now that I have the chance to. So we're really having a good time and enjoying what we get to do. And if Prince is able to put something, I'm sure he'd love to contribute if he's still online.
Okay. And Kweku, what's next after your project on your research on Liberia and the Kru?
Yeah. I think I'm still in the process of collecting more data, and what I went to the Monrovia Kru town, and then I went to the library there and had conversations with them, because I thought I was going to get like some documentary sources, but unfortunately there's little documentary sources. So I think one of the key things that I would want to do is to try to deposit some of the material that I've already collected in other parts of West Africa, British West Africa, to these spaces, right? So as to again prep up interest in and conversations about Kru history. Yeah, but right now I'm going back to Liberia, I think in the summer, to continue with my field work, and I will also be moving to other British West African territories, and then see how the dissertation goes.
Okay, I hope this program, people are able to assist you. People who are listening to it could get in contact with you guys, and both Megan's name is there and Kweku's name is there. So if you need their emails, if they can put it in the chat, you can write them, and they can get in touch with you to discuss more about the history of the Kru. And don't forget, I mean, our time is short, so I know that another program is coming on. We could be on this for another 3 hours, so we would ask Kweku and Megan, when they do their research over the summer, to come back. I know Megan is giving a talk in Liverpool, right, on the 19th, about the
Online.
Kru online. So if she can send us the link, we're going to be able to listen. And Prince is saying he's currently training 20 students from the 10 senior high schools in Greenville on how
Wow.
to do oral history interviews and archaeology. Our initiative is growing gradually, and people are very excited to know the history of the Kru people, as we are about the Grable people as well. But we want to thank you, and we want to say to everyone that this is the LSA Scholar Hour is to bring awareness and to make more people know about the Liberian Studies Association. For those of you who don't know, the Liberian Studies Association will be having its 56th annual conference in Baltimore, Maryland, at Morgan State University from April 24th to the 26th of this year. So please come learn the history. Both Megan and Kweku were at Cornell last year. I'm talking about the Kru. And so if you want to know more, you want to get involved with scholars, please join the Liberian Studies Association. Our president is Dr. JCN Carr, who is online. And we want to say thank you so much. We will definitely have you back on. They said the Scholar Hour, but maybe we should change it to 2 hours from now. 2 more hours,
Scholar
but we don't
hours.
want. Yes, so we have Dankwa at wisconsin.edu and Kucher M at tamu.edu. I think they put it in a private chat, but please get in contact. I can put it
You
EDAN.
can also, I know for a fact that you can just Google our names and you can find both of
Yes,
us. You can find
yes.
both of our university pages and contact us from there.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, okay. I'm also in the private chat, so I don't know. So yes, so please, feel free to contact them if you're able to help with them. Stanley Sion say, I'm a PhD student. I really want to know more about this project. I'm also from Sino. So Stanley, we will say contact Megan and Kweku and get involved with the project. We want to say thank you so much, Megan, and thank you so much, Kweku, for joining us on this. And for me, it's cold. I think in Texas it's not. In
Very.
Wisconsin, it must be.
It's freezing everywhere. Like
It's
it's freezing.
freezing.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So we want to say thank you to you both, and to say please come back again. When we have more time, we definitely want to know more about it. I think we didn't even discuss 1% of what we
No.
want to discuss.
No.
Because I was reading about the last identified Kru man to serve in the British Army, the British Navy in World War II. His name was Benjamin Johnson. And I was going to say, oh, yeah, I want to know about Benjamin Johnson and everything. But then we ran out of time. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of people watching. A lot of people will share this show. We want to say thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. And if we don't see you guys at the at the LSA, we'll be with you in spirit when you're doing your research. But thank you so much. Prince is saying, oh, but Prince is saying he might come to the LSA, so that would be amazing. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. And as I said, I am kind of like always this has been a while, so I'm trying to look for the closing song. But Megan, any last words before we go?
just thank you so much for having us. We've barely scratched the surface, and if this is something that you're interested in knowing more about, please take a look at the sources that are online or reach out to me or Kweku, because I know both of us would probably love to chat more with people who are interested in this history, because it's too important to lose or to forget about.
Yeah, Kweku?
Yeah, I think I mean I'll just say that I'm very excited to learn more about our Liberian history. And interestingly, like I was making a point that in West African colonial histories, we usually like don't focus on Liberia because it was not colonized by any European power, right? But I have the view that it has a lot more to tell us, not only about Liberia itself, but also about the West African region itself, and even the whole continent
Yes.
itself. So I'm so happy and I feel privileged to join these conversations to learn more about African and Liberian histories.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us. Stay safe, stay warm, and remember we are all Liberians. And we will end the show now.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.